activity that will be led by our moderator, Jessie Landerman. So take it away.
Thanks, Angela. You've got our panelists over here. You all are going to be the main event. My name is Jessie Landerman. I am a longtime PIC practitioner. I am a social impact consultant at TCC Group. I also have the honor of teaching at UF in the online graduate program in public interest communication. And what we're going to do, we have 2.5 hours together. Almost none of it will be us sitting up here and talking. But really our goal is to address some of the themes we've been hearing about. How can we build connections and also do that translation work between people who do research and people who do public interest communication? Knowing that a lot of us do both and we want to learn to wear multiple hats, but we're also going to ask ourselves to think a little bit about how do we engage best with our counterparts to help make the change that we all want. That's the reason that we're all here. And so just to share a little bit about my own personal interest, similar to Angela, I've been a public interest communicator for longer than you might want to know, since before that was actually a term. And I did a lot of work in documentary video, and at that point, best practice was, did we move the audience to tears? And if so, you did a good job. And that's a pretty blunt instrument to be measuring the impact of your public interest communication efforts. And so since then, we have a lot more nuanced content about what kinds of feelings do we want to evoke in people. How do we reach the people that we really want to evoke? How do we measure whether they've moved or not? What have other people done who have come before us that we can learn from and build on? And so those are some of the reasons behind the session. We're going to move right into action. And so the first is going to be an icebreaker. We're all going to line up against that wall. So go ahead and get up, and we'll go over here and get to know ourselves and each other a little bit more. And for folks on Zoom, we have a modified version of this for you. Everybody in the room, once they get to this side, is just going to take one step forward when you hear a statement that applies to you. And everyone on Zoom is going to raise their hand, and you all will be able to sort of see some of the shared experiences that we have. You don't have to take the biggest step ever, because you don't necessarily want to run into this. This is a non-competitive exercise. This is cooperative. There's no stepping backwards. We're all just moving forward together in a literal way and a metaphoric way. Okay, so I hope that we're ready on Zoom, because it looks like we're ready in the room. Oh, good, I see the Zoom people. Hello and welcome, Zoom. So take one step forward if you've ever, no, we can come, it doesn't have to be a perfect line, come on. If you've ever worked on a communications project or campaign to achieve positive social or environmental change. All right, I would say that was maybe 80% in the room. If you've ever taught a class or a workshop focused on communication. All right, a lot of educators. If you've ever conducted your own research on behaviors or beliefs. If you've ever conducted your own research on behaviors or beliefs. Matt, should I move, or am I okay standing here? But this way, okay, sorry about that. If you've ever used research or insights from psychology or sociology to improve the work that you do. A lot of people. If you've ever used public opinion or demographic research or data for your work. Many of us. If you've ever conducted message testing or wanted to. So we do not always have that luxury or resource, right? If you've ever partnered with someone outside of your professional discipline for a social impact project. Awesome. If you've ever wanted or needed a thought partner from another discipline. A thought partner. And then there's the last one. If you have ever wished that your work reached more people and had more impact. Okay, great. So we're all in the right place. Excellent. Everyone can go back to your seats for now. It'll be momentary. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to welcome our panelists. Come on up. We'll be on stage together briefly. Thank you, everyone. All right, come on. So we're going to hear a little bit from these incredible folks about the work that they've been doing that touches these themes that we're starting to explore in this session. So I'm going to go in order of the paper, which is not in order of this way. Teresa Gonzalez is an assistant professor of sociology at Loyola University Chicago, focused on cities, public space, and collective joy within Black and Brown communities, among other things. Teresa, this year, your research on narrative, The Stories We Tell, Colorblind Racism, Class Blindness, and Narrative Framing in the Rural Midwest, won the Frank Prize for Research that advances public interest communication. How do you hope that this research can be applied by PIC practitioners?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's been a great long session and morning. So in thinking about both the importance of research and how to apply it to communications, I want to echo something that Alvaro said yesterday, that I'm still learning about public interest communications, and so I'm grateful to be in this space. But there were two, and thinking about this question, there's kind of two overlapping areas. One is about process and method, and one is about kind of a theoretical intervention. So when I think about process and method, and this is echoing a lot of what's been said already, it's both about the importance of speaking with, talking to, but also listening to groups that are oftentimes either underrepresented, invisibilized, or ignored. And that can mean a variety of different things, right? It really is important for us, both as researchers, practitioners, people committed to social change, to think about who might those people be, who might those groups be, and even if when we're targeting particular groups, who might be the populations within that are also going underheard or ignored within these spaces. The other thing is about listening to understand rather than listening to respond or listening to intervene immediately. And this can be especially difficult if you're speaking with groups, individuals, populations who have belief systems or values that are very different from your own. And it doesn't mean that we agree, right, with what is being said, but rather really trying to interrogate so that we fully understand what are the stories, the narratives, the belief systems that are at play, because in listening to understand, that's how we can start making interventions, right? If we go into a space just listening to respond, listening to immediately intervene, it means we're missing a lot of what's happening within these spaces. So that's in terms of like process method, kind of how we go into spaces to really learn about what's happening within them. And then the other thing in terms of both process is also listening to what's not being said, right? We go into a space, we want to listen to understand, but then we also want to pay attention to, as people are explaining processes, as they're explaining their belief systems, what are they ignoring? What kinds of questions are they particularly kind of trying to evade? What is it that's not being said? What is it that's being redirected in very interesting ways? And why is that occurring, right? So part of what I found in the paper, The Stories We Tell, is that as I was working within a small rural town and the rural Midwest, I want to be very careful because rural spaces, everybody knows each other, right? So this is the rural Midwest, and I'm especially vague for a variety of reasons. But as I was talking to decision makers there, and I was asking questions about race and class in particular, these decision makers would purposely evade a lot of these questions, would purposely not want to talk about issues of race, would purposely not want to talk about issues of class. One, because if we ignore the problem, then we don't have to address it. And two, because these are very difficult conversations to have. And for many folks, if they start unpacking the ways that they're also perpetuating many of these inequities, they have to interrogate themselves. And then they think, well, that must mean I'm a bad person, right? And so if I don't talk about it, I don't have to deal with a lot of kind of these uncomfortable feelings. So be really careful in terms of thinking about what's being said, what's not being said. And then also, I'm an ethnographer by training. That means that I enter into spaces with the intention of becoming embedded within those spaces, putting a lot of my own preconceived notions aside to see how folks are making sense of social processes and the worlds around them. And so what that also means is that we oftentimes see, and it's not that people are lying, it's that we create these stories in our head and we think it's absolute fact. So people will say one thing and then do something completely different. So also pay attention to what's happening in those spaces. Where are those disconnects between how people are making sense of things, how they're responding, and then also the actions that they're doing to couple with that. In terms of theory, we have to think about, and this goes back to something that Ermi said in the previous session regarding dominant narratives. Ideology frames how we think about the world, right? Those are those meta-narratives, those dominant narratives. It frames how we make sense of things. It frames how we view ourselves within the world, but it also frames how we're viewing others and then the decisions that we're making. So a lot of those ideologies go unseen, right? That's how, this is what Gramsci says, right? Ideology is unseen, and that's how it's able to perpetuate itself. So if it's unseen and we don't talk about it, then we don't have to acknowledge that white poverty exists. If we don't talk about it, we don't have to acknowledge that this is a country that's built on white supremacy, because we don't talk about it. If it's unacknowledged, then we don't have to address the fact that we have vast inequality that's rooted within the very structure of this nation, right? If we don't actually think through it, talk about it, because that's the ideological framing, then it just we just kick the can down the road, right? So in the paper, very, very briefly, I'm talking about colorblind racism and class blindness as ideologies. If we don't talk about race and we don't talk about class, we can continue to create policies that perpetuate racism and classism and the intersection of those two into a perpetuity, right? We're seeing this overtly in Texas and Florida. We saw this in Arizona, right, in 2010 with the very similar crackdown on Mexican-American studies education within the state. We've seen this consistently, right, rear its head over and over throughout American history, and then overtly, but then also inadvertently and implicitly. People think, I worked in Massachusetts for many years, they think it's a very progressive state. In many ways it is. It's also a deeply racist state, right? But because we don't talk about these things, we have these ideologies in our head, we kind of just keep it moving. It's all in there.
Thank you so much for that. Kristen, I'm going to go to you next. Kristen Buckley will be teaching at University of Florida starting in the fall. Her research ranges from how to communicate in response to backlash and the commodification of protest. So I want to ask you, Kristen, about this application piece. When you think about research like yours, research like Teresa's, how can it be applied by PIC practitioners? How would you hope for the when you're dreaming up your research and we're thinking about, what we heard about, there's the sort of incentives within academia, but there's also the social impact you want to have. How do you think about that?
Well, most of my work is quantitative, so it's not coming from an embedded place where I'm really spending a lot of time with communities, finding out what they need. It's usually more in the abstract, which makes it a lot more difficult to be applied. With the metrics of success for academics to publish in journals that have formulas that are very different from actual change on the ground, it's hard to translate that into something that's constrained by a theory or the scientific method and having it be resulting in actionable change. So those are the main issues that come up with my work specifically. How to make it useful to the people that might be employing it is a question I ask myself all the time. And I think a lot of times with taking this very tiny finding that doesn't really mean much on the ground and trying to apply it isn't very useful, and that goes back to the concept of trust that we've been talking about a lot. How am I useful to a practitioner who wants to employ it if what I'm bringing to them is not necessarily useful for them to employ? So the goals and the stewarding of knowledge versus the actionable change can sometimes be at odds. So that's something that I think will hopefully be addressed in the years to come.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll start to dig into that in some of the small groups, because I'd love to hear, and I'd love for the group to hear sort of some of those examples of, and share ideas of how people have negotiated that, because it's a very common set of challenges that you're describing. I will go to Jaime next. Jaime Gonzalez is a conservationist, educator, and communicator with the Nature Conservancy here in Houston, focused on equity and community partnership. So Jaime, you mentioned that in your organizing for climate justice here in Texas, you've used research from the Yale program on climate communication. How did you apply this national level behavior and opinion research on the ground with communities here in Texas?
Yeah, just to and can you guys all hear me? Just to give you some context about what I do on the daily basis, my measure of success is a tree planted to protect community members from climate change, uplift health, and uplift biodiversity. That's my measure of, so I get to work in a number of different planning processes with the city and the county. I get to do community and foster community-based science. I get to do restoration ecology. So I get to see how all of these ecosystems kind of work together to get something on the ground. And that's the whole point of my job. In terms of climate, I'm not a climate justice activist. I work with climate justice folks for sure, and environmental justice folks. But in terms of like, how do you bring down national research and make it local? You know, fortunately, Yale does a great job of bringing that data down to the county level. And let me just explain one of the complications of communication that we're seeing on the ground right now. So Houston and Harris County are amongst, it's got to be in the top 5 areas in the country that are climate damaged. We've lost billions of dollars here, and anybody who has been through Hurricane Harvey knows how we've had over 100,000 structures flooded. We have people literally with half their house still intact today, and that was in 2017. It's massive climate injustice, dislocation, creation of climate refugees in the city, and then we have refugees from other parts of the world that have been pushed out by climate change. So there's a complication right now in that if you look at the communications from Yale and the polling that they did, we have this really weird juxtaposition. We have a highly damaged community from climate change and supercharged storms and flooding and drought. And yet, if you look at the data, there's only a marginal increase when the question was asked, have you or somebody you know been personally injured or impacted by climate change? The national average is hovering around, I think, 49%, don't quote me on this, but our average in Harris County is floating around 53%. Even though people literally, as I did in my neighborhood, saw people being picked off of roofs by the Coast Guard. We had a mini drought that was like the hottest May, the second hottest June, the hottest July last year. It was brutal. I've worked on the climate plan with the city. We see what the climate forecasts are. So I think, you know, as I'm trying to work with communities in Houston to bring nature interventions with many partners, including those community members, but with the city and the county and other players, that translation of there's a huge climate risk, nature can be part of the solution for not just climate, but public health and equity, it's a broken story. And so without a whole story of the urgency of action in terms of closing health disparities using nature and providing more climate adaptation for communities, it's very hard to push for decision makers to spend the sorts of monies that they need to get communities activated in that way and to get the kind of funding that spurs the action that makes a difference in people's lives. So the national data modeling, infographics and things are great when they're put in the hands of good communicators, right? But the data, it's what I tell people is like the data and the research is the fuel, but it's not the vehicle. So you need stories as the vehicle for that, particularly with communities, and they need to, right, co-create this narrative with you, because a lot of what I do is try to weave expertise, community expertise being super, super important in that. Scientific expertise, sometimes indigenous knowledge, planning, urban planning, you know, all of that stuff. So I think that national research in terms of communications and science is really critical, but you have to bring it down to a level where people understand that it's important and understand it culturally. So, you know, I think that's one of the big things that I'm always thinking about is how does this land in a particular community with a particular cultural outlay, right? And I always have to be mindful of the fact that if research is done in other places, that I have to, as a communicator, have to translate it for a southern city. We're not floating in space. Nobody is floating in space. Everything is context specific. This is a southern city with everything good and bad that means. And so it needs to be told in ways in which it is culturally competent, right? So anyway, I hope that helps. But it is communications is the only way we're going to get to a better world, and it plays a seminal role in getting things done on the ground when it's done well.
Thank you. I appreciate that in terms of the weaving, especially of these different kinds of knowledge, right? Cesar, you are the executive director and co-founder of the immigrant rights organization FIEL here in Houston. And I know that you've participated in numerous national and local advocacy campaigns for student rights and for immigrant rights. How has research about behaviors and beliefs shaped the ways that you communicate with your own community or with decision makers?
Well, first of all, I want to start off by saying that usually when we think of the experts, and I'm not trying to downplay anybody here, but our experts are our community. Though they are the ones that know best, number one, what's good for them, and number two is what they need to have a better life. With that being said, one of the biggest things that we have changed in the last 5 years has been the narrative around citizenship and what people actually really want. When we have folks in DC talking about citizenship or nothing in that narrative space, we're left with nothing. And we've had 30 years of nothing. When we talk to people, when we talk to decision makers, but specifically when we talk to community members, they want the ability to be here. They want the ability to be able to travel back and see their family and just continue to work. So I think that puts into context a lot of what it is, but also the way we approach people is super fundamental in all of this work. Oftentimes we want to get something out of people, but you have to realize that in a lot of these vulnerable communities, you're talking to people who don't want to talk to anybody. I am the anomaly. I myself am an undocumented immigrant. I was brought here when I was 5, and have lived here. I was one of the first people in Houston to say that I was undocumented out loud, at the expense of my mom getting very mad at me, because in our entire lives we were told, don't talk to anybody, don't share, this is sacred space, and not just because it's our lives, but it's because it could have consequences. I grew up in a household where we were told to not speak openly about our status, because if the neighbor were to get mad at us, they would call immigration on us. I grew up in a household where we had a plan. There was a little booklet like this that had numbers and addresses on who to call and what to do in case mom and dad didn't come home. So all of that you have to take care of first before we even begin to ask the first question, right? We have to put ourselves in that space so that we can be able to not only begin to approach those communities, but how do we approach them, and how we frame the questions that we're asking as to not trigger people and make people freak out. One of the things that we've done through FIEL has been that we've created that trust in communities by being there for them. And we're still very old school. We're still, a lot of people, I love Zoom, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people, Alain, who's my partner in crime, and he's our campaigns coordinator, he'll call me at 11 and say, hey, this just happened in Cleveland, Texas, which is about an hour and a half. Can you get in the car right now? And more than likely, the answer is yes, and we're at people's homes at midnight talking and guiding them through processes and things like that. And so meeting people where they're at, speaking their language, knowing their culture, is super, super important. And one of the ways that we've been able to do that through FIEL is by creating that community trust, by being there for community for over 15 years now. And we have... And it's interesting because during COVID, we did a study, and I always tell people, be careful what you ask of us, because we might just do an incredible job. And I'm saying that in the most humble way possible, because we were asked to do a study around COVID, and they said you have about a month And so we hired canvassers, and after hiring and onboarding and stuff, we had 20 days left to figure this project out. And with 8 immigrant women, we were able to knock on 7,000 doors and garner 3,000 responses to a survey that completely changed the way the county approached people around COVID and vaccines and outreach. But at the same time, we were very deliberate in not just taking from people, but also offering the help. And you would be surprised at how many people we were there, and they had no idea what was going on. And we were the first people to go knock on their door. But they opened the door because they saw the T-shirt, they saw our logo, they knew who we were, and they said, these are folks that we can trust. Albeit, though, it is very expensive to do that. And so that's the other thing, that in all of research and all of this, one of the things that we encourage folks to take into account is supporting those organizations like FIEL and other folks that are on the ground so that they can continue to work. Because we get calls all the time from universities and colleges and they or researchers in general, and they tell us, we need 30 participants for this study. And we're like, that means we have to do the 3 times, which means that we have to secure 90 people and contact them 3 times and make sure we contact them in 3 different ways. So if my math serves me right, that's about 1,000 contacts that we have to make. And that's a lot to ask from an organization who's community funded, who's community-based, who's rather small, when there's other people out there that have massive budgets. So I always encourage people to take that, aside from everything that you are already doing, take that into account and make sure that's part of the process. And in some way, you leave something behind with the folks who are providing you with your test subjects or with people that you're talking to.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing a little bit more about your work and where you sit in this web of impact that we're all creating together. One of the things that keeps coming up for me is how all of our work is deeply embedded. It's deeply embedded in order to be effective. We need to be embedded with community. We need to be building trust on the ground. And so next we're gonna break into groups and talk about how we're gonna translate that for each other. And so this activity, if you see, there are easels set up around here. We're gonna bring around some whiteboards. And what we wanna do first is for folks in the room and folks on Zoom, think about the hat that you primarily wear as either a communicator or a researcher. And so you can think about maybe some of the icebreaker questions we did, or maybe that's very clear for you, acknowledging that we are all multiple things. We wanna think in our lane. Are we communication practitioners? And so I'm gonna send the first group off with you, Jaime. So will you raise your hand in the room if you primarily identify as a practitioner? You're a communicator. Okay, wonderful. Can you all, we're gonna get up and go to this wooden easel in the back. And Jaime is gonna lead you all there, and there's whiteboards right over here next to the cartography exhibit. Wonderful. Our next group will be researchers. They can go with Kristen. Researchers, stand up. And we have an easel here. And I want to say thank you, Lori and Piper on Zoom. Please go ahead and make groups there as well. We've got 4 questions here that we're going to answer. So folks who didn't get up yet, are we researchers? Are we practitioners? We're hybrid? Okay, so for educators, I want you to, we're gonna think about which one of these lenses you wanna take on, because educators, you're sitting in the middle, right? You're often doing a lot of these things, and so the questions kind of overlap, but Teresa, would you mind leading some educators over here in this activity? And whoever's left, let's come to this easel right here in the middle. And so we have some whiteboards. If you're on a practitioner table back here with Jaime, if you look on the left here, when and how has research, either opinion research, messaging, social or behavioral research, helped your public interest communication projects? How did you identify and apply that? What barriers are you facing? And what would you like to ask researchers for? We have ourselves right here in the room. We can make a wish list and actually let folks know what is it that we need. For the research groups, when and how have connections or collaborations with communicators helped your research project. So not just community members, we want to think about communicators specifically, folks who are engaging in projects where, as Jaime discussed, right, where we need to communicate in order to achieve the change that we're trying to get as a community. Think about the barriers and then what wish list you want to make. So we have about 20 minutes for this exercise. And I'm going to come around. If groups are a little bit larger than we need, we've got some extra easels. Hey, everybody. We're going to take 5 more minutes. I think most folks have gotten to their wish list so far. So 5 minutes from now, we're going to report back to each other. So please make sure you have your wish list ready and that someone in the group other than the facilitator is going to report back. All right. You all will get to keep talking to each other in these groups in the next round. So make sure you capture those thoughts on the board. You can stay where you are. We're going to report out from the groups. We're going to hear from each other. So I actually want to go to Lori and Piper first on Zoom and ask you all if we can hear back. All right, I'm going to give us 1 second in the room to just kind of get settled in for the conversation. The facilitators, you can stay with your groups. Keep it casual. All right, thanks everyone. Okay, I think we're getting close. So to start out, I want to hear from the practitioner group on Zoom. Facilitators, just help me get your groups ready in listening mode, please. All right, so on Zoom, Lori or Piper, can you ask someone from the practitioner group to answer what you guys found for these first two questions about how and why you are using research for communications projects? Oh, they need another minute? Okay, we can start in the room. Great. Let's see. So can the practitioner group, Nicole, I see you back there. I'm not sure if you are, and Ginger are appointed reporters. So how did you all answer those first two questions? When and how has opinion, messaging, social or behavioral research helped your PIC projects? And how did you identify and apply that research? Yes.
There we go. Okay, so why? We came up with, it helped with speaking to executives. That was a big one. Also understanding insider language, collaboration, and it helped build credibility and allowed for really informed storytelling through that research. So I think the three-step process that was written down was research, opinion, and then action-oriented. So you go through those three steps, and research helps lead to those and understanding opinion. And then the second question, you want me to go with that?
Mm-hmm. How was it identified and applied?
Primarily, we came up with two things, building networks and improving systems.
Wonderful. Hemi, do you want to share any more on those first couple of questions from your group?
So Ginger's doing a great job, but there's a couple things. I think that that three-step method is really important. You do the research, but I tell people all the time that communities are not maps, not polygons on a map. They're actually people. So aligning the research, which is often based on big data, with personal stories about impact. And also, and one of our folks talked about, always put action steps, bright spots, and empowerment in with that. Don't give them terrible news and say, have a nice day.
Yeah, that's so important. And that's actually something that in my work, I learned in parallel, both just from working with folks and saying, hey, you can't keep telling these stories like this. It's exhausting and people are getting demoralized. And then lo and behold, there's also research that has rigorously tested and proven that hypothesis. For our other communication practitioner groups, are we ready on Zoom to report back on the first two questions?
I would like to nominate, is there somebody from our researcher group who would like to share out? I'm putting folks a little bit on the spot here.
Oh wait, are you
Carrie?
asking for the three of us that were in the research room to talk about what we talked about? Okay.
Yes. Carrie, would you like to share for the group?
Oh yeah, but Brandy and Jack can also kind of chime in. Was there a particular question you wanted us to focus on?
Yeah, we were looking at the first question. So not the barriers yet, but just sort of when and how are you making this bridge happen?
Yeah, I think it was easier for Jack because he's part of an institute for public communication they work all the time, from what I understand, with nonprofits. For me, as a researcher, I tend to reach out to people who do communications who are activists, or they work at Greenpeace or PETA or Human Rights Watch or something, or the Nature Conservancy, and I talk to them, and then I put their input, in my books, and this is usually done with me analyzing also the content of what they're producing on their websites or their persuasive materials, and then finding out from them as the producers of those materials, like, why are you doing it this way, or what values are you interested in appealing to? And so that's the way that I've done it, is like trying to learn from them. But then I'm also making recommendations in any article or book about what I think is the best practice, which usually goes along with what they said, but might be something additional or maybe even contrary. So that's how, anyway, that's how I was talking about it, but I'll let Jack or Brandy chime in.
Yeah, I'll just add, working with the Center for Public Interest Communications at UF, we work really closely with a lot of the communicators and really design research with them from the start, middle stage, and then talk about findings. So it differs, but we're kind of lucky to have like they're almost like our clients. So if there's any way you can get practitioners as clients, that works for us. So there's lots of different ways that we try to do it, but when you get them, it's great.
Hey, Vern, I would just chime in from the practitioner side. In our breakout room, we had a lot of great conversation, mainly around some of the questions around ethical questions that come up when you're working with research. And again, not to put anyone on the spot, but Peter, do you want to quickly flag the question you had just asked at the very end before we ran out of time? Because I think it's a great question that's on the mind of practitioners often. If you're still on. Maybe, all right, so the question Peter had at the very end was kind of around the ethics that come up, I think, for practitioners, particularly when you go into research. Do you have a framework in mind, particularly those in PR agencies? Do you already know what you want? Are there push-pulls? Are you going into it knowing exactly what results you want? And how do researchers push back on that kind of mindset or approach in practitioners?
Great. Anyone else on Zoom want to share, either from the researcher or practitioner point of view, on those first couple questions, sort of how and when you're making those connections? All right, we'll come back in person. Kristen's group, would you all share what you found on those first two questions? Yes.
Matt? Sure, thanks. Okay, they're on. Okay, first question. We said if you can find like an authority figure in the community who can help garner like respect and trust and also help you get interviews and make people feel comfortable talking to you, respecting their ways of designating authority. So it might be rude and you might kind of burn bridges if you just go in and start asking people. If you can like do research with them instead of, like, for example, like when I do things with like indigenous communities, I didn't know at first that like you're supposed to go to a specific person to ask if you can ask other people, or they might ask for you. You can't just go around and start asking people. And then don't just assume you can talk to anybody you want. And then if you can show how similar work that you've done in your own community or in other communities has worked out well, I think social media is really good for that. Or sometimes I'll bring like recordings of other interviews and stuff I've done, or maybe you can like explain or show them like a paper that you've written that was like received well and that like you write in a positive way, so that they know what this could look like later, so that they don't just have to trust that you're going to do something that's not like a negative outlook on their community with this.
That's awesome. We also identified media outlets, both formal and informal, mainstream, community-based ones, for finding people, and also locating the big mouths, the people in the community that would be willing to participate and engage with you, is another key way to do that. And then for the second question, as far as what we can do to show and build those relationships, is just showing up, investing interests, identifying those local authority figures, as well as media and news that people actually consume, and getting the word out there that way.
We thought establishing trust between researcher and their team and the community is very important. Sometimes, depending on the topic, that might be a sensitive topic. They might have to talk about personal experiences. So we thought it's important to establish that trust, and that doesn't come suddenly. It has to be established probably over a long time, or with shared experiences, staying with them for some time, or through the leads from their own community.
Great, thank you. Over here with Angela and Teresa, our researcher, educator, multi-hyphenates. How did you all, is there anything else that came up in your group around how and when you're collaborating with communicators?
So I have this one. So in true open-ended focus group format, we allowed the conversation to take us in a different direction, and had a robust conversation really focused in on interventions and ways to kind of, for both researchers, practitioners, and people who navigate multiple, I think, areas. So I'm happy to share that now or later.
Yeah.
Now?
Go for it.
Okay, so we have a whole list. Part of it is simplifying language, theory, and ideas, and so that includes knowing one's audience. So on the part of folks who are, researchers who are faculty members, that's knowing that and understanding, making our work more accessible to a broader audience is a completely different genre of writing, and this is where public interest communicators are key. And can do a lot of work in both guiding us in making that work more accessible, but also training us in ways to do that, and also collaborating with us and making that work more accessible. That might include news stories that boil down research, learning to write op-eds, right, to get stuff out to a broader audience. One member suggested having departmental money to hire a departmental PR person who could do a lot of this work because, as Natalie mentioned, faculty are pooled in a multitude of different directions and may not have the time or the capacity to add an additional thing, right? So having someone paid to assist us in doing that work can be really key. The other issue is evaluation, pre-tenure faculty, right? And E had mentioned this yesterday. Pre-tenure faculty are not encouraged to do this kind of work. That's not part of our metric for evaluation. And so if we're in those positions that are tenure track, at many, not all, but many institutions, I'm lucky to be at one that does include this, but many institutions do not. And so if it's seen as something that's not moving our career forward in a very particular way, it can feel like an additional burden or added work. So just having folks that we could work with at the university, at the department, can be really helpful, while simultaneously training graduate students and faculty on how to do this. Another great idea was to use many universities that are land-grant universities have extension, so collaborating with the extensions to do a lot of this work to get our research out, because they're supposed to be community-based in this way. Building a network of researchers, practitioners, people who kind of move through these variety of spaces so that they could do the work. For instance, if I knew I could connect with this network, say, I would like to get this work out in this way, I don't know how to write in this way. You have training sessions that I can attend, great, or can connect me with folks on how to do this, great. That's one way of bridging that gap. And then also folks who are doing, activists at community-based nonprofits, policy, whoever it is who want to get access to research, also know I can go to this place to find folks who are doing this work. It makes it a little bit easier than trying to, right, folks said, putting calls out on Twitter, putting calls out on ResearchGate, using Facebook, just like doing cold calling. That can be both burdensome in terms of time, but also weird, right? Because you don't know if cold calling is really even gonna work. We also had a really great idea here for as folks are writing more research academic-based articles at the end, in the conclusion, also say, all right, what are some of the best practices that we can learn from this in terms of how this can be implemented, right? Not just thinking about, I have concluded, this is like whatever, blah, blah, with my article, but also now what does this mean outside of this space? What does this mean on the ground in our communities? How can this be implemented? And then things like challenging paywalls for academic research, simplifying our abstracts, right? So it was mentioned that oftentimes communicators are looking at the abstracts of research, and if they're very convoluted, which I hadn't even thought about, I'm thinking this is the abstract for people who are reading this stupid paper, right? That are other, right, academics or graduate students, not outside of it, but I'm like, oh, it is accessible to everybody, and if that abstract is simplified in terms of this is what this is what we're doing, this is the importance of it, that also makes things a lot easier for everyone. And then finally, just recognize that this is education for everyone and that we should really try to be more useful and intentional in our work. Does anybody want to add anything? Great.
Wonderful, thank you for that. So the next question, I think that we've been hearing from each other about barriers, but that doesn't mean that we've heard all the barriers, right? Or we've heard exactly how they apply to each of us. And so I want to do a round about barriers, and then we're going to go to our wish list for each other, which you all started to move us into. Cesar, would you mind having someone from your group share what are some of the barriers that you named as practitioners in applying research to inform your communication projects and decision making?
I think I got it. Yes, thank you. Okay, so we had a small but mighty group, and we had an awesome conversation. And there were several things discussed about barriers, and I think one of the key things was we looked at what is the purpose of the research, and that's very important. Also, who the researcher is writing for, and I think that group touched a bit on that. Is like, depending on the audience they have in their mind, that's how accessible the paper is. So accessibility is important. Also, how centered and representative is it of the communities that the research is, based on? That's an important context too. Also, I guess some of the other barriers we talked about. So we need to understand where the research is coming from to be able to use it. Because our group was a mixed practitioner group, mostly doing translational work. In addition to that, I guess it's the cost of accessing the research, such as paywalls, time, because there's a lot of time invested in trying to understand the research, to use it. Those were the main points. Anything you want to add?
I think the final one was addressing questions that are not just interesting to us or to the researcher, but that are relevant to the community, like what needs to be asked. Not just saying we want to do this because we want to do it, but rather, what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, how useful is it, and what's the context?
Thank you. Ginger, did you all have anything different than that, or that you want to add on from the other practitioner group? Yeah.
Just a moment.
If you do the mic, then they'll hear you on Zoom.
Yeah, you'll see we have a lot more for barriers in our wish list, so the practitioners over here. But one of the things that stories that was told was a woman from Egypt talking about research papers that she's having to digest. She's here to understand the Western lens, the global North lens, and then has to try to not only translate it language-wise, but then go back and translate it into her society, how that research applies. So that is definitely a barrier, which goes back to representation, which I think was mentioned, just a little bit of another access of that. And speed also speaks to accessibility, so equity, that kind of thing. So yeah, everything else, we are with you on that.
Please, yeah.
Just real quickly, I think that there was a really great comment that if you're doing a body of research that you think is a real aha moment for the community, maybe talking ahead of time before you publish that paper with your local communications folks, if you have any, to create a set of infographics or easily digestible social media content that goes with that. So you don't release the paper and then think the world's going to change, but rather work with communications professionals to have allied content that you can push all out at the same time.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that translation work that we need to do often also needs to be collaborative so that we can be speaking to everyone that we want to engage. Lori and Piper on Zoom, do you all have any more barriers to share? We're going to move into wish lists next.
Hey there. No, I don't think so at this time. I think we're good.
Okay, do you all want to kick us off then for the wish list? What did you all, will you let us know, which you can either speak from the researcher group or the practitioner group, and let's hear from each other. What is it that in our dream world we would get from each other in order to start making this bridge?
I don't have anything from the practitioner list to add. Does anyone in the research group have anything to add? I don't think so. No, I think we're good for now.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't get to this
Oh, go ahead.
the wish list question.
We
but,
didn't either.
Probably cobble something together, but yeah.
Well,
we ran out of
We
time.
talked a lot about the barriers of like, oh, we'll do research and then we can't get it, or we might send it to some people, but we don't know that they ever use it, or sometimes we feel like we're trying, but with our limited resources and time, we're not marketing our own research that well. Although Jack had put some links in the chat and mentioned several organizations that are useful. Jack, I don't know if you want to mention those organizations to us again, as at least for the nonprofit world to reach other like activists.
Sure. Yeah, we've had success going through the conversation and SSIR. I can drop the links in the chat. Yeah, and op-eds are great as well.
And then nonprofit
And
quarterly.
one other
you
one
mentioned.
that we talked about as well. Nonprofit quarterly. Yep, that's.
Conversation.com, and SSIR stands for Stanford Social Innovation Review. I didn't know that. Yeah, and then having your stuff be open access as much as possible, or having open access versions of things, so it's not behind that paywall, which you all mentioned, and then having updated contact information on our own websites for when practitioners do want to reach us, that it's easy for them to get to us or find out what we're doing. And also for us, going to conferences that are for practitioners is good. Sometimes it's difficult. We have such limited funding, like to actually make the time to go to those conferences in addition to scholarly conferences is difficult to do. But sometimes conferences overlap, like this one is doing, or like I was just at the conference on communication in the environment that's from the International Environmental Communication Association, and that is an association for both environmental communicators and people who work in academia in that field. So I think the more we also have professional organizations that bring us together, like, hey, we're all environmental communicators, whether you teach it, research it, or you work at Greenpeace or something like that. Anyway, that's good as well, those kind of organizations.
I think that's so important when we think about the spaces, right? Because we've talked about the paywalls, and maybe peer-reviewed journals are not necessarily the space where we're looking for that. Do we need to create additional spaces online and in person where we're able to come together and do that translation, or we're able to go and know someone has done that translation work and they've left it here for me, and that's the resource. Or I can go there and say, oh, I really need someone, as you said, with contact information. To be honest, as a practitioner, it didn't even occur to me. I heard a colleague saying, oh yeah, she calls the researcher and asks them. And I was like, you're allowed to just call, how do you find in the researcher? And then you say to tell them that yeah, that sounds like a dream. And that's just something that, hadn't even occurred to me. I'm trying to do those translations on my own as a layperson. So I think you're giving me a lot of ideas, which I appreciate. So let's move into the rest of our wish list. I know that that's been kind of woven in already, but I want to go around the room and hear what are the things that we want to ask each other for that would be helpful in our work. And I'm gesturing towards questions group, so let's just start there.
Before Angel reads our wish list, I wanted to shout out one other barrier that researchers have, which is the potential for harm of the people that you're speaking with, the fatigue that they have, any sort of burnout and bureaucracy that researchers have to deal with. I think that's something that comes up quite a bit with being able to make those relationships last and sustain them. But over to Angel with our wish list.
Okay, time, help with access to donors and funders, telling the stories with dignity, authenticity, and honor, education from them so that we're not just stuck in a literature bubble, ask us the questions they want answered, and connections with community members, identifying education gaps.
So you all want to hear the questions that we want answered, huh? I'm curious, to put someone on the spot, what is the right moment in your research process to be, like, how do I get to you all as researchers in time, right, to help shape that question?
We would probably reach out, I would probably reach out like in the beginning before I go to the community to start the research. Like that's how I would go about formulating my research questions. Is I would know the community ahead of time, reach out to some people in the community ahead of time, and then say, like, what are some questions that you have that you would like answered? And then I would probably incorporate that into the overall set of questions.
Yeah, so it has to do with those ongoing relationships that over time we're able to kind of be go-tos for each other to kind of shape that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to add that sometimes I approach it too as like when I did when I was a journalist, and sources would reach out to me with story ideas. And if somebody from a community member reached out to me and said, that they had X question, I'd think about whether or not that fit within my particular research trajectory. And if it did, I'd be interested in talking to them more about it. And if it didn't, maybe I could direct that person to somebody else who actually did that kind of research. So I think that if you have something that you think needs to be answered, reach out to any researcher that you can find that does something similarly, or does something related to whatever it is that you're interested in, and don't feel like you can't reach out, because I think I speak for a lot of us when I say, please, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Yeah, let's just go free form. I think all of us have wish lists, and we also have things we can commit to, and so yeah, please.
Okay, so following up on what Summer said, which is an excellent point. I'm coming from, I work for university marketing and communications, and all of your universities has a similar department. It's probably called a different thing, public affairs or media relations, whatever. But I'd like to reiterate Summer's point, that is, you can reach out to us. You as researchers know when you have something that is exciting you and you want to share it. Well, give us a call. We're always looking for great stories to tell. I've personally, a lot of my team has alerts set up, so whenever a paper with University of Houston is published, we get an alert. And I'll tell a quick story because it really makes a point. So there was this great paper that was published, very exciting research. I sent 2 emails to the researcher, no response. I happened to know the husband of the researcher and forwarded one of my emails saying, can you please make sure she sees this? And I have a response. A lot of times we don't have the time to go to those lengths to track it down. So a lot of times I get the question is, when should I tell you? Well, as soon as you get a paper accepted by a publication, let the university media relations person know, let someone on your team know, and they will work with you, because then the next question is, well, we have an embargo. We'll work with that. We can get a lot of work done, we'll be respectful, but we need to know so that we can help translate your research into narrative. So,
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, Teresa.
Just to add on to both of these amazing things that were said, is that in addition, as researchers, we should also be reaching out, right? We shouldn't just be waiting for folks to reach out to us. We should be reaching out to institutional resources, right? Like marketing and PR. If there's a Center for Community Engagement or Community and Research, reach out to those as well to see, is there any overlap? Not just in terms of the research that I'm doing, but in terms of training students, and maybe we can do, right, more community engaged work with our students as well, that are answering some of the questions that are happening within the communities around us. Reach out to, you know, area nonprofits and activist groups and say, this is the kind of work that I'm doing. Is there any overlap? Can we work together? One of the projects that I'm working on through being connected with the Center for Community Research and Engagement, I was able to tap into a mayor's health task force, which seemed like it had nothing to do with my research, and then ended up having everything to do with my research, right? And so I was able to work with and work alongside local nonprofits in Lawrence, Mass, to get feedback on, you know, survey instruments, incorporate questions that were meaningful to not just the local municipal government, but also area nonprofits doing similar work and in trying to you know, raise awareness about particular things. So there's ways that we can also be a little bit more proactive in terms of initiating those conversations, engaging those conversations, and making people more aware about the work that we're doing. And then the only other thing I'll say is that never underestimate the power of just being in community and talking to people about the kinds of work that you're interested in and the kinds of work that you're doing, because I can guarantee, as much as, and this has been said so many times this conference, I appreciate it, as much as academics like to think that we're experts, and we don't know everything, and there's a lot we don't know, and so many other people are doing similar work just from different angles, and collaborating on those projects makes the work much more impactful, right, and long-term, and ensures that it's sustainable. So just, I think, opening up some of those parameters a little bit.
Thank you. What other ideas came up? Yeah, Giselle.
There were just two things I wanted to share. One is, I had a question that I haven't really heard answered during the conference, which is how often and how well do researchers go back and share with the communities they have obtained their information from, the results of their research. And not just the results of their research, and of course in a way that a community, whatever way a community needs that presented. And then not just that, but also how, if say, not, you know, it's being utilized by nonprofits or other groups for policy advocacy or other terms, is that also being shared back with the community that was the origin of the information in the research? And I just wanted to share how I think how easy it is to do that and how much respect and credibility it creates. Mm-hmm. I've even done it with farmers in southern Nigeria via phone, when I finally, after I've gathered their stories, and then they're going to be on the internet, which they may not even see, you know. The other thing is it possible to create a list of vetted public interest communications practitioners that researchers can go to, you know, look up and maybe ask to assist them in any of this kind of communications? I mean, I'm just wondering if the Public Interest Communications Institute or some other body could establish that.
I love your question, and I would love to respond to it, to both of them, and I invite others to do so as well. One of the most effective ways that in my community engaged research, which is about sexual health and HIV, has been communicated back to the folks who shared their stories was actually through theater. So we did a report for nonprofits so that they could understand how, you know, have the insights about community that we had gathered in these different listening tours. And then we said, okay, this is useful for the nonprofits and the social service organizations. However, what about for the actual people? And so we made an ethnographic play. And it became a way to bring stories to life, to engage, to bring joy, to bring the community back together and continue the conversation in a way that was relevant there. So I really appreciate the question. And then my next, you set me up right for the very next piece, which was to think about what are the commitments we can make as well as the wish list. I want to keep going on folks' wish lists and this fabulous brainstorm. But one of my commitments would be to offer myself to partner with researchers to do sort of what Teresa was describing. Is it a one-pager? What is the translation work of your research? I think that myself and lots of others in this room would be interested in doing that, either as a conversation series, as a blog series, or something like that. I think it's a fantastic idea. Yeah.
Hi, something on my wish list as a practitioner. I am a journalist. I work for a journalism support organization, and the way I use public interest communication research is to inform other journalists about the research that's been done on narrative change and language and framing and how it impacts the communities that they are reporting for. And so often I am trying to communicate research about language and framing to journalists to convince them to use one thing or another. And I'm lucky that in journalism there is a very high efficiency business-to-business journalism market. There's a lot of reporting research, which is great. But man, I would kill for researchers, especially if you have your own website and you can find it, to just have some social media graphics with the highlights of your research that can be easily shared. If you use Canva, oh my gosh, it's the easiest thing in the world. You can make a template with just some highlights, and it makes it so much easier to share with other people, so that you're, some of the work isn't translational as much as it is just putting it in a different format.
Thank you. Yes, please. In the front.
Thank you. I think for the first question is for us, like community organizers, we're trying to build a community, and research help us to build a community. I think since start working in the field with the research, my wish list is every research intentionally and with the expectation talk to the people and say, but this time we're gonna present the results and we want you to be part of the results. And that make community, and that make more strong our communities in any research you can do. I think that's the two words always I want to hear, like intentionally with the expectation, and that can be awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, Cesar.
I don't know if this has been said already, but I think it has to be said too, that a lot, or most of this, I would say maybe 99% of it is English only, and physically translating into a different language is something that we highly encourage, but in a way that people can understand. I was just telling the story to my group that the Spanish that I use is not the proper Spanish that my mom uses, but we use that Spanish because for folks in my generation, they understand it. Whereas if you start using like super huge words, I have a hard time saying them in Spanish. And so I think that's interesting, and it reminds me of in 2010, I was working with day laborers, and I made the assumption that day laborers spoke Spanish, and without realizing that they spoke dialects of Quiche and then different dialects from Guatemala. And so that was a learning experience, but then that also taught me to not like clump everybody and say, okay, all Latinos speak Spanish, because that's probably one of the biggest mistakes I made at that time.
Yes, a hand in the back.
I'm a money person, so I'm in fundraising. And so I'm going to just talk about the elephant in the room, which is people getting paid. Academics being paid for their work. Our research is a reflection of our brains, right? It becomes like a part of who we are. It is giving the world our knowledge. And in the academy, that's supposed to be free, but it shouldn't be, especially given the fact that folks in industry can make a tremendous amount of money from our brains. So if you are using our facts and figures and numbers and you need us to make money on your end than just, you know, give some folks a little bit of change.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate the issue around language justice and how important it is for us to center, you know, both as a barrier but also as a wish list. I think we often tend to see that as almost as a problem that has to be dealt with, rather than taking more of a, you know, a universal design approach, if you will, where language justice is centered, and, you know, what would our work look like if it didn't just become like, oh, we have to translate it, you know, like both languages or in all of these other ways, but if that was a commitment that we made to ourselves, and how would that reflect in our ethics, in the way we do our work, in the ways we disseminate, you know, whether it's research or other things. So I just wanted to reiterate.
Yeah, language justice is not an afterthought. It's not just a Google Translate at the end. Absolutely. Do folks have more thoughts on their wish list? Because our final topic is going to be around what we can commit to, which has started to happen in the conversation, both as individuals and also as a whole, as a community, as groups. Ginger.
One of the things we came up with, and there were several already mentioned, but was a repository of some sort. And the idea, could AI be used to leverage tools and resources and research? So.
Folks have other ideas or offers in the room?
I mean, and it came up organically in our conversation, but I think one of the most important points was, I think, to keep in mind the humanity and the context in all our, you know, work. So.
Yeah, Jaime.
Yeah, I think we had a really good conversation about like a wish list, and I would just wanted to add, like, you're talking about researchers getting paid for their time and community members getting paid for their time.
Yes.
You know, not assuming that they can be volunteers for the research. But one thing that kind of was starting in our group was, I'm thinking that, you know, we need to weave together different disciplines, but we're also trying to weave together different knowledge systems and value those expertises. It's not just community knowledge. So when we think about research, we always think about Western research. But for instance, in the world that I work in, we're trying to really weave together as well traditional ecological knowledge, which has a lot of resonance, but it's different than Western research. So this is called two-eyed seeing, when you actually merge. You're not merging these two systems. They're running in parallel, but it's helping to inform. And I think with community knowledge, it needs to be seen as being equally, or if not more, valid than Western research, so that you're weaving knowledge systems together. They're not going to be the same. They're going to walk in parallel to increase the efficacy of those changes that you want.
Yeah, over here.
Yeah, just to speak off the point, I was also in the group in the corner, and I didn't know how to say this in a tangible way. And I don't come from the research world, and if I do come from data, soft data around storytelling and honoring the whole person behind the data. And I often think about when we do social research, like how is the framework one that promotes and enhances the colonial framework, and how do we decolonize that, and what methods, approaches, strategies, trust building, relationship building, are we using to interact with people, especially marginalized populations, especially populations that don't have privilege and access, and then do we honor and respect that they don't, and do we have the cultural humility to approach it from a lens that doesn't reaffirm, caste, power, and whatnot. And I didn't have a tangible ask, and I also didn't want to have it come across like I assume that all researchers are colonizing the people they work with. That's not my, I don't think that's the intent, but I often I don't know what the request is, and I don't know if I have a request or I'm just talking in circles, but like how do we move in a direction that allows people to be fully honored in their experiences in the way that they're valued and use our whatever we have, intellect, experience to merge with theirs rather than to be at a level that is high, at a higher level of hierarchy, right? So I think we often like assume that people we research don't see it like that, but I often don't think like we do operate from like a lens of liberation and solidarity, and like that's maybe a lot of my intentionality about how I work with people and who I work with. And if I'm not honoring their experiences, then who am I tapping into in the neighborhood or community that is honoring their experiences and their way of life and their method of communication without judgment? So that's I don't know what the ask is or if somebody else wants to piggyback on that, but yeah, those were like the thoughts flowing through my mind. Like how do we take research, rearrange it in a way that honors the people that we're engaging with in a way to liberate them? So kind of my thoughts.
Thank you. I did get it, and that is on my wish list as well. Thank you for adding it. Yeah. Oh, great. Yes. All right, friends on Zoom.
I'm happy to read this one in, but Jack, I'm not sure if you'd like to. We had your wish for fellow researchers.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. Well, all the credit goes to Jack here. Great idea. For fellow researchers, a wish is to make your website or social media easy to find and follow and keep updated with research you want to be found for. So let us as practitioners find you. And Jack notes that a lot of times the Center for Public Interest Comms has trouble finding researchers' updated contact information in their latest research. So if there are ways that we can, have the conversation between practitioners and researchers, keeping that more open and knowing to whom we should go when we've got questions about particular areas of research, that'd be super helpful.
Great. Well, I blew right through our breaks. Oh, do we have more? Do we have a final? Oh, I'm sorry. So I blew right through our breaks. This has been really fantastic. I've learned a lot. I stand by my commitment to help do that translation work. And I just want to also say a huge thank you to the organizers of this conference, because this space really is creating that and allowing us to do that translation, because it does take us being together in real space, in digital space with each other to build our field of practice. So thank you all.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. I thought we were going to have another round so we can continue the conversation. We have a little bit of extra time because we have lunch coming soon, I believe. Right, so lunch is at 12:30. In the meantime, it will be super helpful because we're, of course, thinking ahead to next year. Wonderful people outside Faith and Mel, who have been our student assistants, and they are working on social media, and they would love to get some testimonials from you. So if you want to go on video and just for a short time say why people should come to this next year and what you're getting out of it, that would be super helpful. Just check in with Mel and Faith outside. And if you are doing social, and you want some fabulous photographs, Joe Newman has been taking photographs, and he has been putting them in a place where you can access them, and it is bit.ly/PIC. It'll be, yes, okay. I think it's PIC 23. Sorry about that. Yeah. Anyway, look up here shortly, and there will be a link. So if you want to access photos, feel free. Please just credit Joe Newman. So let's continue chatting, take a break, and we'll have lunch here at 12:30. Thank you. So thank you, and we'll see folks back online here at 1:30.